The sun was shining, and the smell of grilled food filled the air as neighbors gathered for the annual Oak Ridge Estates summer barbecue. It was one of the few events where everyone, regardless of their background or opinions, came together to enjoy a relaxing afternoon. My son Danny had been looking forward to it for weeks. At 12 years old, he had already been through more hardship than most adults. Born with spinal muscular atrophy, he relied on a wheelchair to get around, but that had never dampened his spirit. He was the kind of kid who could brighten any room, who never complained about his challenges, and who had a deep love for cheeseburgers, something he saw as a simple joy in life. I was flipping burgers at the grill, chatting with Jim and Lisa, when I noticed her approaching. Karen Whitmore. She was one of the HOA board members, but more importantly, she was the self-appointed moral authority of the neighborhood. She had spent years trying to impose vegan-only guidelines in community spaces, arguing that meat consumption was a direct attack on the planet. It was one thing when she handed out pamphlets or gave disapproving stares, but today she had a different energy, one that made my stomach tighten with unease. Karen strode toward the table where Danny sat with a few of the other kids, happily eating his burger. She had that tight-lipped expression, the one she wore whenever she was about to issue a demand. I put the spatula down and started walking toward them, already sensing trouble. "Danny, sweetheart, do you know what you're eating?" Karen's voice was sugary sweet, but I could hear the sharp edge underneath. Danny, oblivious to the brewing storm, smiled up at her. "Yeah, a cheeseburger. My dad makes the best ones." Karen visibly cringed, as if he had just told her he was eating pure poison. "Oh, honey, that's not food. That's the rotting flesh of a tortured animal. It's full of hormones, suffering, and filth. Do you really want to put that in your body?" Danny hesitated, his eyes darting toward me. I was already moving toward them, but before I could step in, Karen reached out and snatched the burger from his hands. "Hey." Danny protested, his voice small but firm. "You don't need this garbage, sweetheart." "I'm doing you a favor," she said, tossing it into the trash can nearby. That was when it happened. Danny's expression crumpled, not just in sadness, but in sheer humiliation. The other kids stared, wide-eyed, whispering amongst themselves. My son, who had already endured countless surgeries, physical therapy, and being left out of sports and playground games, was now being publicly shamed for eating a meal he loved. And then he started crying. Karen sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Oh, come on. Don't be a baby about it. One day you'll thank me when you're not dying of heart disease." I was 2 steps away when she did the unthinkable. She reached down, patted his cheek in mock sympathy, and then before I could stop her, she slapped him. It wasn't hard. More of a condescending, dismissive tap, but it stung enough to leave a faint red mark on my son's pale skin. And that's when the world stopped. For a second, there was silence. Then Danny let out a small, stunned gasp, and the sound shattered me. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to react, but I had to breathe. I had to remind myself that I wasn't just a father. I was a grown man with control. If I let rage take over, I'd be the one in trouble. And I couldn't give Karen that satisfaction. Instead, I knelt next to Danny, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay, buddy?" His lip quivered, but he nodded. He was embarrassed, humiliated, hurt. And I was done. Karen had no idea who she had just messed with. I took a deep breath, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. Every part of me wanted to explode, to make her regret ever touching my son, but I knew that reacting emotionally would give Karen exactly what she wanted. Instead, I turned to Danny and gently wiped the tear off his cheek, making sure he knew I was here before standing up slowly. Karen was still standing there, arms crossed, her face twisted in self-righteous arrogance. She had no idea the storm she had just unleashed. I kept my voice calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of warning in it. "Karen, I'm only going to say this once. If you ever lay a hand on my son again, you will regret it in ways you can't even begin to imagine." She scoffed, rolling her eyes like I was being dramatic. "Oh, please. I barely touched him. Kids these days are too soft. Maybe if you didn't stuff him full of garbage, he wouldn't be so emotional." That was it. I turned to the entire gathering, neighbors, families, people who had witnessed everything, and raised my voice. Everyone saw that, right? A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. People nodded, some whispering, others shaking their heads in disbelief and disgust. Even those who usually tolerated Karen's antics were now visibly uncomfortable. Jim, one of the longest-standing members of the HOA, stepped forward. Karen, that was way out of line. You don't put your hands on a child. Ever. Lisa, standing nearby, crossed her arms. I don't care how much you hate me. What you did was disgusting. Karen's confidence faltered for the first time. She hadn't expected pushback, and definitely not from people she considered allies. But Karen was never one to back down easily. She huffed, pointing a finger at me. You people don't get it. You're poisoning your children. This neighborhood should be a progressive, forward-thinking place. You're all stuck in the past. Meat is murder. And I'm not going to stand by and let children be raised in such an ignorant, unhealthy environment. I could see several people rolling their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen had always been extreme, but this was insanity, and I was about to end it. I pulled out my phone in full view of the crowd and dialed. Karen's smug expression shifted slightly, but she tried to keep her stance firm. Who are you calling? The police? What? Because I took his burger. That's not illegal. That's... Hello, officer. I need someone at Oak Ridge Estates Park immediately. There's been an incident involving the physical assault of a disabled child. The second I said the words physical assault, Karen's face drained of color. Now, she was nervous. And she should be. She had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood with HOA fines, ridiculous rules, and self-righteous lectures, but this was bigger than a parking violation. Bigger than her ridiculous HOA mandates. Karen had just crossed into criminal territory, and I was going to make sure she paid for it. Karen visibly stiffened as the weight of my words settled over her. Physical assault. She had spent years controlling people through intimidation, fines, and out-of-act nonsense, but she had never faced real consequences until now. The color drained from her face as I watched her brain scramble for an escape route. Oh, come on, you can't be serious, she sputtered, her voice a mix of panic and indignation. I barely touched him. It was just a light tap. You're blowing this out of proportion. The crowd of neighbors, who had witnessed everything, weren't having it. Lisa crossed her arms, shaking her head. Karen, I've seen you do a lot of things over the years, but this? You put your hands on a child. A disabled child. There's no talking your way out of this. Jim, a longtime HOA supporter who had previously tolerated Karen's antics, took a step forward. I don't care what your views on meat are. You don't slap a kid. Ever. More murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The tide was turning against her, and she knew it. Karen let out a harsh laugh, trying to regain control of the situation. Oh, so now I'm the villain? Because I care about this neighborhood? About these kids? I was just trying to help him. She was cut off by the distant sound of sirens, and that's when she snapped. Her entitlement morphed into full-blown rage. Her face twisted. She whirled back toward me, pointing a shaking, manic finger at my chest. You did this. You're ruining everything. You and your disgusting, animal-eating, small-minded. I held up a hand. Karen, I'd stop talking if I were you. Her jaw clenched, but she couldn't help herself. This isn't over, you hear me? This neighborhood is going to fall apart without structure, without rules, without someone keeping degenerates like you in check. Before I could respond, the police cruiser pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. One of them, Officer Miller, was someone I recognized. He had been on previous calls when Karen tried to involve the authorities for ridiculous HOA complaints. Noise violations, fence height disputes, parking fines. But this time, this was different. Miller took one look at Danny, still sitting in his wheelchair, his face stained with tears, the red mark still faint on his cheek, and his expression hardened. He turned to me. Sir, can you explain what happened here? I nodded. Karen here slapped my son after taking his food and berating him for eating meat. Multiple people saw it. Karen's face twisted in outrage. That's ridiculous. It was just a light tap. He was crying over nothing. I was trying to help him. Miller turned to Danny, lowering himself to eye level. Hey, buddy, can you tell me what happened? Danny sniffled but nodded. His voice was small but clear. She took my burger. Threw it away. She said I was eating garbage. I told her to stop, and then She hit me. Miller's jaw ticked. He slowly turned back to Karen. Is that true? Karen floundered. Well, I mean, he's exaggerating. It wasn't like that. I was just trying to teach him something. You people are acting like I... Miller held up a hand, cutting her off. Ma'am, put your hands behind your back. Karen froze. Wait, what? What do you mean? You can't. Miller stepped forward. You just admitted to putting your hands on a child. That's battery. Karen let out a shriek of disbelief. You can't arrest me for this. Miller didn't flinch. Ma'am, you can come quietly, or I can add resisting arrest to the list. Your choice. The crowd was dead silent as Karen flailed. You're all insane. This is ridiculous. You're arresting me for a slap. He was eating flesh. I was saving him. Her voice cut off when Miller turned her around and placed handcuffs on her wrists. You have the right to remain silent. And for the first time in years, Karen finally was. The entire neighborhood stood in stunned silence as the officers secured Karen in handcuffs. Some people still couldn't believe what they were seeing. After all these years of tyranny, control, and self-righteous HOA nonsense, Karen was finally facing real consequences. Not just some homeowner backlash, not just an argument at a board meeting, but actual legal action. Danny gripped my sleeve, his voice small and hesitant. Dad, is she really going to jail? I looked down at him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. She's going to answer for what she did, Bud. That much I can promise you. Karen was still rambling, still pleading, her voice rising in pitch. I didn't hurt him. You're making a mistake. This is oppression. I have rights. I was protecting him. Officer Miller gave a dry, unimpressed look as he finished reading her rights. You can tell that to the judge. Karen thrashed in frustration, trying to twist her wrists out of the cuffs. Oh, come on. I demand you call the HOA president. He'll explain everything. He'll tell you I have the authority to enforce community standards. A sharp, cold laugh rippled through the crowd. Jim, the longtime HOA board member, stepped forward, arms crossed. Karen, you were the HOA president. Karen blinked. Lisa, smirking, chimed in. And you got removed, remember? The whole HOA was dissolved months ago. You don't have any power. The realization hit her like a truck. Her eyes darted wildly, as if desperately searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. She had nothing. No HOA rulebook to hide behind. No ridiculous fines to weaponize. No overblown bylaws to manipulate. Just the cold, hard reality that she had gone too far. And this time, there were actual legal consequences. I watched as the officers walked her toward the squad car, her protests fading into the distance, swallowed by the murmurs of the stunned crowd. Lisa shook her head. Never thought I'd see the day. Jim exhaled deeply. Neither did I. But she earned it. Every bit of it. I felt Danny tug on my hand. Dad, can I have another burger? A chuckle rumbled in my chest, and I ruffled his hair. You can have as many as you want, Bud. That's when something unexpected happened. One by one, people started stepping forward, neighbors who had stayed quiet before, afraid of Karen's wrath, afraid of what she might do if they crossed her. Lisa turned to me. Hey, if you're still grilling, I think we could all use some food after this mess. Jim nodded. Yeah, and some beers. Maybe a toast to, what do we even call this? The day Karen finally got what she deserved. A few chuckles spread through the crowd, but then Lisa grinned. How about Freedom Day? The day this neighborhood finally got to breathe again. The idea took off instantly. Someone grabbed a cooler of drinks, and within minutes, the tension that had gripped the community for years began to lift. The barbecue turned into a full-on celebration, laughter and chatter filling the air. For the first time in a long, long time, the neighborhood felt alive again. Karen had tried to control everything, but in the end, she was the one who lost it all. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the celebration only grew stronger. What had started as a simple neighborhood barbecue had now transformed into something much bigger, a true community gathering, something that felt natural, effortless, and free from the suffocating grip of Karen's control. For years, she'd imposed strict HOA rules, enforced fines, and made people miserable with her condescending judgment. But now, She was gone, sitting in the back of a police car, while the very people she had terrorized toasted to her downfall. I stood near the grill, flipping another round of burgers as Jim handed me a beer. You know, I've lived here a long time. I never thought I'd see the day Karen got what she deserved. Lisa, sitting nearby, let out a laugh of agreement. I still can't believe she actually got arrested. It's like a dream. A really, really satisfying dream. I chuckled, but my eyes drifted toward Danny, who was now laughing with the other kids, finally relaxed again. That was what mattered most to me, knowing that Karen would never be able to hurt him again. But as I took a sip of my drink, something unexpected happened. A black SUV pulled up near the park entrance, parking in the same spot where Karen's car had been just an hour ago. The mood shifted slightly as people turned to look, their conversation fading into murmurs. The door opened, and a tall, well-dressed man in his late 50s stepped out, his expression a mix of confusion and authority. Jim narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell is that?" Lisa let out a groan. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me. That's Karen's husband." My grip on my beer tightened. "She has a husband? Since when?" Lisa shrugged. "He travels a lot. I think he only shows up a couple times a year. He's never really been involved in the HOA nonsense. But judging by the way he was marching toward us, that was about to change." I stepped forward, ready to meet him head-on, while the rest of the neighborhood watched silently. He stopped a few feet away from me, looking around at the barbecue, at the families enjoying themselves, at the absence of his wife. His voice was calm but cold. "Where is Karen?" I folded my arms. "Sitting in the back of a police car." His jaw tightened. "Why?" Lisa crossed her arms. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe because she physically assaulted a disabled child over a cheeseburger." His entire body stiffened. Jim scoffed. "Yeah, your wife finally crossed the line she couldn't walk back from." The cops didn't take too kindly to that whole slapping a kid thing. Karen's husband exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples as if he was trying to process the situation. "God damn it, Karen." I raised an eyebrow. "You don't sound surprised." He let out a long sigh, looking around at the neighborhood he had barely been a part of. I should have seen this coming. There was a beat of silence, and then he shook his head. "You know what? I don't even care anymore. I was planning to file for divorce anyway. This just gives me one hell of a reason." A stunned silence followed. Lisa's mouth fell open. "Wait, what?" Karen's husband looked exhausted, like a man who had been dealing with her nonsense for far longer than he ever should have. "You people don't know the half of it. I travel for work. I'm gone most of the year, and every time I come home, I have to listen to her go on about saving the neighborhood and fixing society. It's exhausting." Jim let out a low whistle. "So you're telling me you've been married to HOA Karen, and you're just now realizing she's the worst person alive?" He chuckled bitterly. "Oh, I knew. I just didn't care enough to do anything about it. But this? Assaulting a kid? That's a whole different level." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his car keys, tossing them in the air before catching them again. "Anyway, I just came by to grab a couple of things from the house before I leave town for good." I raised an eyebrow. "Wait, you're leaving for good? What about Karen?" He smirked. "She's Karen's problem now, not mine." With that, he turned and walked back to his SUV, leaving behind a stunned crowd of neighbors who had just witnessed the most unexpected plot twist of all. Lisa was the first to recover from the shock. "Well, that's one way to end a marriage." Jim let out a booming laugh. I gotta admit, I almost feel bad for the guy. Almost. I shook my head, watching the taillights disappear down the street. So Karen lost the HO, got arrested, and now her husband's leaving her. This might be the worst day of her life. Lisa grinned. Good. She earned it. And just like that, the tension lifted again. The grill fired back up, the music played louder, and the celebration continued, because for the first time in years, the neighborhood was finally free. Karen was gone, and there wasn't a single person who missed her. The next morning, the aftermath of Karen's downfall lingered like the final echoes of a long overdue storm. The neighborhood, once gripped by her tyrannical HOA rule, was free, and people were finally starting to realize what that meant. No more random fines, no more unwanted surveillance, no more fear of getting reported for nonsense violations. For the first time in years, people could just live their lives. But Karen had lost everything. The police released her late that night, but not before charging her with misdemeanor battery and community disturbance violation. I had already filed a formal restraining order, ensuring that she could never come near Danny again. And her husband's sudden departure left her with one final, devastating realization. She was truly alone. And when Karen felt powerless, she did what she always did. She lashed out. The final meltdown, Karen's last stand. That morning, as I was drinking my coffee on the porch, I saw her. She was storming down the street, her clothes wrinkled, her blonde bob slightly frizzed, as if she had barely slept. The usual air of superiority was gone, replaced by something wilder, more unhinged. Jim, sitting on his porch across from mine, noticed her too. Oh, here comes the ghost of HOA's past. Lisa, walking her dog, stopped in her tracks. Are you kidding me? She has the nerve to show her face after everything. Karen marched straight toward my house, stopping at the edge of my driveway. She pointed a shaking finger at me. You, she spat. You ruined my life. I sipped my coffee unfazed. You did that to yourself, Karen. Her eyes blazed with fury. You got me arrested. You turned the whole neighborhood against me. My husband left me because of you. I raised an eyebrow. Pretty sure he left because he finally realized he didn't want to spend the rest of his life with a dictator in yoga pants. A few snickers echoed from the neighbors who had gathered to watch. Karen's face twisted in rage. This is a wine neighborhood. I spent years building this community, keeping it safe from people like you. I tilted my head. You mean people who just want to have a barbecue without being slapped for eating a burger? She ignored the comment, her hands balling into fists at her sides. You think you've won? You think you can just push me out? This neighborhood is going to crumble without me. Property values will plummet. Crime will skyrocket. This place is going to turn into a hellhole. Jim, who had just finished watering his lawn, leaned against his fence. Karen, you do realize that since you were removed from the HOA, property values have actually gone up, right? Turns out, buyers prefer neighborhoods without unhinged dictators running things. Lisa chimed in. And crime? Oh, please. The biggest crime in this neighborhood was you harassing people over mailbox colors. More laughter from the growing crowd. Karen's face flushed bright red, her entire body shaking with frustration. She looked around, searching for anyone who still supported her. But there was no one left. Even the few people who had once sided with her were now standing on the sidelines, watching in stunned silence. For the first time in years, Karen had no power, no influence, and no allies. And she knew it. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes wild, and then she snapped. With one final dramatic scream, Karen turned, ran into the middle of the street, and started throwing HOA violation notices at people. Yes, actual paper violation notices. From her purse, Lisa dodged one as it fluttered pathetically to the ground. Oh my God, is she serious? Jim caught one midair, reading it aloud. Grass is 0.5 inches too tall, $1.75 fine. Karen, what are you doing? The HOA doesn't exist anymore. Karen kept throwing them, her voice rising into a hysterical shriek. You will respect order. You will obey community standards. You will. Karen, go home. Someone yelled from down the street. A chorus of voices echoed the sentiment. You lost, lady. Give it up. Seriously, get out of here. She froze, staring at the people who had once feared her, once followed her rules, once nodded along with her tyranny just to avoid confrontation. But now, they were laughing at her, mocking her, calling her exactly what she was, a joke. Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might start crying. Then, with a final scream of frustration, she stormed off back to her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The second she was gone, the entire block erupted into cheers and applause. Lisa wiped fake tears from her eyes. That was the most beautiful meltdown I have ever witnessed. Jim chuckled. Think she's finally done? I smirked. Knowing Karen, she'll probably try one last desperate stunt. And I was right, because the next day there was a for sale sign in front of Karen's house. The final goodbye. Karen leaves for good. Karen's final act of defiance was leaving Oak Ridge Estates forever. Within a week, moving trucks arrived, and she packed up her miserable existence and drove away. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. No one cared. And as her car disappeared down the street for the last time, Lisa raised a beer in the air. To a Karen-free neighborhood. The entire block toasted to that. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge Estates was truly, completely free. And as I sat on my porch, watching Danny happily play with the other kids, I knew this was the way it was always meant to be. The weeks after Karen's departure felt almost unreal. For years, she had been a constant presence, a looming shadow over the neighborhood, dictating everything from lawn heights to mailbox colors. Now, with her gone, Oak Ridge Estates finally felt like a real community again. People were relaxed, kids played outside without the fear of being scolded for disrupting neighborhood harmony, and the days of pointless HOA fines were officially over. But the biggest transformation, Danny. For the first time in years, my son wasn't afraid to just be a kid. He no longer hesitated when he rolled his wheelchair out onto the front lawn, no longer worried about disapproving glares or whispered complaints about how his wheelchair ramp was ruining the aesthetic. He smiled more, laughed more, and for the first time since Karen humiliated him, he was ready to host his own barbecue. That's right. Danny wanted to celebrate. And this time, it wasn't just a casual cookout. It was a neighborhood-wide event, a true final goodbye to the tyranny of HOA Karen. We called it the Great Freedom Barbecue. Jim, Lisa, and half the neighborhood helped set it up. We had grill stations, homemade side dishes, tables full of desserts, and Danny's personal request, an entire section dedicated to different styles of burgers. Danny sat at the main table, helping to hand out plates, and when people asked him what he wanted on his own burger, he grinned ear to ear. Extra bacon. Lisa laughed. That's a solid choice, kid. You've got good taste. But just as we were getting comfortable, something unexpected happened. A familiar black SUV rolled up to the edge of the park. The chatter died down, and a few heads turned, recognizing the vehicle immediately. Jim frowned. No way. Lisa narrowed her eyes. Is that? The door opened, and out stepped Karen's ex-husband. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what he would do. Was he here to defend Karen? To confront us? To demand we apologize for getting his wife arrested? He took a long look around, then made his way straight toward me. I set my plate down, squaring my shoulders. Something I can help you with? He paused, glanced at the massive barbecue setup, at Danny, at the smiling, happy neighbors, then looked back at me and smirked. Hell of a party. Got room for one more. The entire neighborhood burst into laughter. Lisa shook her head, chuckling. So, you're not here to cause problems? He let out a dry laugh. No. Just figured I should meet the people who finally did what I couldn't. Jim raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Karen's ex leaned in, lowering his voice. Got rid of her. That was it. The final confirmation. Karen was gone for good, and even her own ex-husband wanted nothing to do with her. I chuckled, gesturing toward the grill. Well, in that case, grab a plate. There's plenty of food. And just like that, we added one more to the party. As the evening went on, as music played, drinks flowed, and kids ran through the grass, I sat back, taking it all in. Danny was happy. The neighborhood was finally free. Karen had spent years trying to control this community. And in the end, all she did was unite us against her. We didn't just survive her reign. We thrived in spite of it. And as I took a bite of my burger, extra bacon, just like Danny's, I knew. This was how life was always meant to be.